Okay, this is part 2, or part B of chapter 8, labeling. This is, for you that are counting, slide 16, and we'll go through slide 32. The last 3 or 4 slides are just a summary of the chapter, so you'll be able to go through those on your own. All right. We said earlier that power played a big role in the labeling process. And of course, the people who have the most power are usually the upper class, and the people that have the least power are the lower class. And so in most of these theorists' idea, the upper class use their power to be able to label and control the lower class. And so lower class people are most likely to get and be affected by the label. So these were, basic questions they looked at. Why certain people get labeled and how. Again, that indicates a process theory. The effect of the label on subsequent deviant behavior. And again, the whole idea about labeling and relabeling. Once a deviant labeled, chances are limited. Relabeled again, and of course the 3- and 4-time loser really faces an uphill battle. And then, of course, the last thing about the criminal justice process, particularly decision making, and how it is affected by things like age, race, and social class. All right, along with Becker, one of the other labeling as a cause of deviance. Sorry, it skipped and went 2 for me. The idea of criminogenic influences. This came from Wilkins. He referred to this as deviance amplification. 2 parts of this. Number 1 is it catches the attention of the audience and they watch those people. We call that confirmation bias. Okay. So you're looking for things, and if you look long enough and hard enough, you'll find other things to label them deviant about or criminal about. Okay. And the second is internalized by the person. The label is internalized. We call that either role engulfment or self-fulfilling prophecy. If you tell someone often enough and loud enough and continuous enough, they will begin to believe that's who they are or what they are. All right, another major contributor in the labeling field is Lemert, who also wrote in the 60s. And what he had introduced us to was the concept of primary deviance and secondary deviance, which kind of plays back on that last slide. So the primary deviants are those normal initial acts that all of us engage in. They're usually not significant, and again, their cause is not important. But people continue to do some of those, and particularly if they get labeled, then the actor realizes the label and its effect, and he or she begins to adapt their behavior to the deviant role. And of course, part of that is who is left to hang out with, who's the people you associate with. And once you get the label, there's a lot of limitations that come with it in terms of social interaction. So here's the definition of secondary deviance. Acts committed as a result of accepting the deviant label and taking up the deviant role. So you have to believe that's what you are. You are a criminal. You are a delinquent. You are a deviant. And then you take up that role. That becomes your identity. Notice also part of that is you have to internalize that deviant identity and change your self-concept. If you remember when we talked about drift with delinquency, we said exactly the opposite of that. That middle class kids drifted in and out, and they were able to rationalize through those modes of adaptation. So this is just kind of the flip side of that. And as Lemert said, those deviant acts or deviant behaviors that are committed under that new identity, the one that you accepted, is what he calls secondary deviance. Okay, just hold tight. But secondary deviance comes from two things. One is feedback from society. We keep telling people, you're no good. And then we call this retrospective interpretation. After the fact, after they've been labeled, we go back and, in essence, examine their past behaviors and say, oh yeah, he or she was deviant before, and they were delinquent, and they were criminal. Look at these other things they did. So it's a way of justifying our own label. And the other is through that weak self-concept. And here's where the symbolic interaction contributes. The delinquent, the deviant, the criminal sees themselves through the way that others react toward them. And they begin to act up to that expectation. There's the key phrase. If everyone believes it, it must be true. Now, this whole idea of retrospective interpretation comes from another author. You don't have a slide on this. His name was Schur, S-C-H-U-R. And he identified 4 steps of labeling. And you'll see 2 of these are things that we're talking about in terms of secondary deviance. The first is stereotyping, that we stereotype people, someone who cheats on a test, other teachers talk, other students talk, and he or she becomes a cheater. That's a stereotype. And maybe even their family members or close friends are stereotyped as well too. The second element is just what we talked about there, retrospective interpretation. Society or the audience looks at prior behaviors and analyzes them through rose-colored glasses because they are looking through that confirmation bias. Third, and a big one that we haven't talked about, is the element of negotiation. And it comes back to that concept of discretion. A lot of what happens and determines what label it ends up with in criminal court is negotiation with the key actors or key professionals. That can be the police, the prosecutor on what charge or charges, if there's a plea bargain as well too. There's a lot of discrimination that goes on, So all those things are part of determining what that label will be. And the fourth is Schur's term, role engulfment, what Lemert called weak self-concept, accepting the role and taking on that role. Okay? All right. Now, all of us have different statuses. You are male or female. You are African American, Caucasian, Hispanic, Latino, Asian, whatever. Certainly your social class is probably part of your status. Your major in school, where you work, all these things. Okay? But labels can transcend all those other statuses. Becker coined the term master status, which supersedes any and all the other qualities or statuses. And that's what really shapes people's identity. And this is very true. We see in the criminal world, people are ex-cons, criminals, murderers. We never say they were rehabilitated. Okay? We never say they were transformed. Okay? And you can lose your previous identity and take on a new one. And I think probably, two of those are Joe Paterno and Bill Crosby, which are identified there. Paterno was a great football coach, and of course the sexual assault on young boys scandal at Penn State tainted that, and that's not what he's remembered as now. Bill Cosby, great comedian, actor, and again, he is tainted by what happens. He has a new master status, and that is sex offender. Okay, the examples of how that stigma works, the Schwartz and Skolnick study, where they made the 4 employment folders. You can read this is in your book. Sent it to 100 different employees, 25 for each applicant, and everything was kept the same except for 4 things, and it would just, the 4 different kinds. In one, the applicant was tried and sentenced for assault. Another one, he was tried for assault but acquitted. Third, he was tried, acquitted with a letter of the judge from the judge. And fourth was no mention of criminal involvement. Okay. So again, even the best, even where there is no mention, 9 out of 25. But as you see, the more stigma there was about the sexual assault, the less likely they were to be considered for the job, even though it was fake. So, another famous study is Rosenhan's study of mental institution. This was 1973, it was called Being Sane in Insane Places. And what Rosenhan did was take graduate students, they went to different mental institutions across the United States, and they feigned symptoms of schizophrenia. They all said they heard voices, Once they got in the institution, they stopped that and acted normally. I think there were 9 of them. 8 of them were diagnosed as schizophrenic. 1 was bipolar, or back then it was probably called manic depression. And all of them were released, if I remember correctly, but in remission, not cured. And the only people that recognized these guys were feigning the mental illness were the other patients. And again, the whole idea of remission and schizophrenia, which has, a huge stereotype. It is not a split personality. It is not multiple personality. But that is kind of the urban folklore, and apparently believed even some in the professional field. Reckless's school-based labeling studies, the good boys, bad boys. Good boys did better in school across time. They arbitrarily split them as more or less intelligent, and intelligence was attributed to one group, and the more intelligent performed that way. Groups reversed, and the new more intelligent also did better. So even when they were randomly assigned, gifted children labels affect later outcomes, as well as remedial labels too. Okay, so here is the process of criminogenics. First, the original or initial act of deviance. And again, as we've said several times in this chapter, no concern of why to begin with. Second, then it has to be detected by someone. It has to be observed or come to someone's attention. Now the discretion kicks in, and race, gender, socioeconomic status, all those things can affect the discretionary decisions. If professionals in the criminal justice system choose to exercise their discretion, then they're going to label that person. And that's why in the juvenile court everything was informal for years, because we saw the stigma of being called a delinquent and how that could affect you and push you into that secondary deviance later in life. Fourth, the creation of the new identity. You are identified as delinquent, deviant, or criminal, and you're shunned. You're put on, Becker's term, the outside. And the fifth is acceptance of the label, role engulfment, new self-identity. You internalize that you are an outsider. And the sixth and last then is deviance amplification. Because of the stigma, because of the new associates, there will be new and sometimes more severe acts of crime or deviance. All right, labeling as conflict. Okay, I told you earlier that sometimes conflict theories and labeling are together in the same chapter. Not uncommon, and of course conflict was part of the 60s, just like labeling. So this should not be a real shock to anybody. So societal reaction is conflict-based, particularly in terms of power, social status, those kind of things. And those with power label others as a way of gaining more power and control over them. So, particularly the conflict theorist, they say labeling is a product of class control. It's a way that the people with power, the upper and middle class, control the lower class. And the focus is on the processing, not on the offender. The second part of labeling is secondary deviance, which we talked about from Lamert. Notice here in secondary deviance, there's a shift back to the offender, not the reaction, because we're looking at why a labeled offender engaged in further deviance. What motivated him or her? So we see the offender change from receiving a label to being a perpetrator of new crimes. Policy implications. These are sometimes called the 4 Ds. This is radical non-intervention. We still do some of these things. Diversion. Avoid the stigma by putting people through informal programs, substance abuse, anger management, Job Corps, vocational training. Due process, by balancing the scales of justice and giving everyone certain rights in a criminal trial. We're trying to even the playing field a little bit. It doesn't matter if you're poor. Okay. For example, like the right to counsel. Decriminalization. Very simple. If we have fewer crimes, there'll be fewer criminals, because there's just fewer things to label them as. And we did that with juveniles. Took status offenders and runaway things out. There's an argument about that for small-time drug possession. The fourth is deinstitutionalization, looking for alternatives. Obviously, prison carries a much stronger label than being on probation. The more a convicted felon can stay in the community, the better his or her chances, and part of that is family support, and part of it is there's just a lower stigma. The fifth D, which is not on here, but I want you to add, is discretion. by employing more discretion, whether it's the police, the prosecutor, the judge in the sentencing process, but certainly they can control the number and types of people that are labeled through that. Graduation programs, for example, drug court, and I've attended several drug court graduations. It is a ceremony. They're trying to get rid of that. If someone can go through and successfully complete drug court, we begin to think he or she has been transformed. They've been rehabilitated. But if they serve their term out in prison, our assumption is not the same. All right, so that concludes our discussion. I encourage you to read the 4 other slides, which are summaries. Those should help you. And of course, then remember you have a writing assignment that's due this week. So I hope things go well. And I'll see you next Wednesday.